What if the terrifying truth about our origin was waiting in clay that hardened 5,000 years ago? An instruction folded into myth, a manual disguised as legend. Raymond Foster had lived his adult life believing that was the sort of idea grant committees and tenure committees laughed out of the room. He was, by training and temperament, a man of margins. Marginalia in brittle monographs, footnotes scrawled in the university's unused pages, a freelance linguist who translated for obscure journals and private collectors. He made a life reading codes the rest of the world skimmed as poetry. He had learned to love the small certainties of script, the angle of a wedge, the way a break in a line could change the world. At 54, Ray carried those certainties like a lamp. His office in Cambridge was a cathedral of paper. Photographs of tablets pinned to corkboard, half-scored transliterations tacked beneath maps, a calendar with the date of a recent conference circled in red like a wound. He had a habit of tracing cuneiform signs with ink until his fingers smelled faintly of graphite. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, he would sit with a single symbol and watch the light change over it, as if new meanings lived in the way the sun slid across clay. M37 was one of those symbols that would not settle. It was a tablet no bigger than a paperback, a fragment with one edge ragged as if gripped by a hand in a hurry. Ray had come to it through a dealer in Istanbul, and then through 3 legal passages and a lot of guarded email. Its provenance was respectable enough, a private sale after an estate dispersal, catalogued against a single blurred photograph of a ziggurat. But provenance, in his experience, was the kind of detail that could be softened by cash and memory. What stayed with him was the line, precise and stubborn, a phrase that in every accepted reading became a kind of syntax-free nonsense. Northern breeze 3 times, door opens. Colleagues translated it into metaphors, into weather and ritual. A priestly invocation, an agricultural plea, some argued. Others suggested a journey north, a wind that carried omen. Ray kept the phrase like a splinter under his skin. Literal translations had their place in lexicons and philological exercises, but he suspected, increasingly, that the Sumerians had not been content with metaphor alone. He thought myth might be engineering. Encoded processes slipped between ceremonial phrases so that only a patient, practiced reader could see the pattern. The room where he worked smelled of coffee and old leather. Margaret, the woman whose patience kept his life from spilling into ruin, knew the map of his obsessions. She could find him by how the light hit his desk at midnight, and by the thin noise he made when a sentence folded into an idea and refused to leave. In the year they had been married, she had learned how to move in a household where the past intruded like a second tenant. She would set 2 cups of tea and not comment on Ray's tea going cold. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked him once, not with accusation, but with the soft practicality of someone checking a leaky pipe. "Sometimes," he said, and took the cup, fingers stained with ink. Margaret was not a scholar. She booked flights, made lists, and kept a small garden of herbs on their narrow terrace in Cambridge. She read Ray's margin notes when the mood struck her, tracing his hand like a lover might trace a portrait. She had called some of his pursuits obsessive in the early days. By then, she had learned to say unresolved and fold her worry into a steady, contained love. One November night, rain lashing the window panes, Ray sat hunched over ME37 with a lamp throwing a circle of yellow across the clay. Outside, the world was the usual mixture of municipal hum and the occasional student's laugh bleeding through the alley. Inside, time was something he could press to see how it bore weight. He had been following a pattern in the tablet syntax, a nested repetition rhythm that suggested function rather than story. It was subtle, syllables, repeated roots, but it was there, a mechanical architecture behind the poetry. He read the phrase aloud because he had read it enough that saying it dispersed some of the fog. Northern breeze 3 times, door opens. The words sat in the air between him and the lamp like latent heat. He had dreamt the phrase, heard it in the wash of his mind for months, as if his own cerebellum had become a repository for someone else's chant. That night, there was a different quality to the repetition, not the tired echo of a chronic insomnia, but a thin, luminous thread that vibrated against the bones of his skull. Ray had friends in the field, people who respected him for his care with vows. But academic life is a theater of polite dismissal as much as rigorous debate. He had presented preliminary notes on ME37 at a small conference. He remembered the polite nods, the way one senior professor had adjusted his spectacles and called the phrase likely ritualistic. Ray had wanted to shout that ritual could be practical, that priests recorded procedures like engineers conjure schematics, an old man in a temple with a stylus mapping out a process for the evolution of human attention. Instead, he had folded his paper back into his folder and listened to the echo. And so he continued, night after night, tracing signs until his wrist ached and his back reminded him that he was still made of vertebrae. The blue of the city outside bled into the blue of the lampshade. Somewhere on the shelf, a radio hummed an ancient advertisement. Margaret had left earlier, a note on the kettle that said she'd be at the opera, a charity performance, and Ray was alone. The blue came without warning. At first, it was only a tint that seemed to leach the yellow out of his lamp. Then it congealed into a plane, a wash that moved like cooling glass over the desk. It was the color of a deep vein, of a gem caught in merchandise light. Ray's breath held automatically. His hands went still on the clay. There was no sound at first, no crackle, no mechanical whir, only the pressure of something unreal accumulating at the edge of the room. The tablet's wedges reflected a pale, impossible light that seemed to rearrange their shadows. Ray felt a prickle at the base of his skull, the kind that signaled a waking dream. The figure appeared where the blue pooled, not like a body emerging from space, but like a pattern folding into a place. It occupied the light rather than the air, an absence shaped around intention. It was tall in a way that ignored human scale, slender, with an architecture of joints and planes that resembled sketches Ray had seen of ancient figurines. Elongated, purposeful, not indulgent. Its surface was not flesh. It absorbed the lamplight and returned it in soft pulses, as if it was a conduit for information. If one had been composing a profile for a visitor to ancient Uruk, one might have used terms that made the being sound familiar. Observer, envoy, practiced intelligence. But close up, the being was stranger. An implausible economy of motion, precise limbs that curved like calligraphy, a face that arranged itself into attention without the need for muscles, the way a light shifts into focus. It moved as if someone off stage had given the order and it responded, a mechanical grace that registered no astonishment at Ray's presence. Ray did the sensible academic thing. He fumbled for the recorder he kept for late notes and realized his fingers felt thick and remote. He had studied depictions of non-human figures in Mesopotamian reliefs, those horned crowns and stylized collars, and the memory of those carvings rose now like embalmed language. But this was not a horned king. This was something else, an intelligence wearing the geometry of attention. He could not hear a voice in the room, yet a statement formed in his mind as clear and declarative as if written in bold type. You read the marks as story. The thought was not auditory. It arrived as a compass of meaning inside him. It obliterated his usual critical buffer, those academic reflexes that said, verify, cross-check, filed under improbable, because it carried with it an insistence and an offer. Ray, who had spent decades trusting the calibration of texts, recognized the structure of an argument even when it was telepathic. You read the marks as story. They are not story. They are instruction. We wrote in ritual because ritual travels. Within Ray's experience, the being's communication mapped the tablet into functionality, like an overlay of exclamation sliding over encrypted text. The message did not require words. It arrived as images, tactile and precise. A priest cupping a small stone between calloused fingers,
A column of students bowed in a cool hall, soundless syllables causing a drift of dust to hang like suspended script.
Ray's first reaction was a scholar's suspicion. Hypnosis, a neurological misfire, a late-onset auditory hallucination induced by chronic stress. There was a list of diagnoses he could form: migraine aura, temporal lobe activity, sleep deprivation. He reached for them the way a swimmer reaches for the edge of a pool. And yet, what arrived next was not a hallucination in the usual sense. It had internal logic, a syntax that matched the fractures in the tablet that no one else seemed to agree on. The being projected a line of imagery, a map almost, over the clay. Ray saw fields as if viewed from above, furrows forming circuits. He saw a ziggurat like a machine, terraces not only of worship but of orientation. He saw priests adjusting small stones into a framework, their mouths shaping a repeated pattern until the stone reacted and a person's gaze sharpened. The images did not come in tidy frames, but as overlapping impressions that suggested action, concept followed by effect, link by link. Not myth, the thought insisted, codified practice. We encoded survival in ceremony because stories travel. "You're wrong," Ray said aloud before he could stop himself. The voice felt inadequate to the scale. The being considered this with what looked like patience. Then, more internally than externally, it delivered a sentence shorter than any thesis Ray had ever read. "We will show you." That was the inciting line, the promise that changed the axis of everything he had done until then. He had expected contact, perhaps, in the way popular books promised contact: interviews, staged panels, strange photographs. He had not expected a personal translation in his cramped office at 2 in the morning. The room seemed to lean inward, the blue surpassing its initial tint and pooling into a brightness that needed no bulb. Ray's instinct was to reach for his phone, to call Margaret, to tell someone he trusted. He did not. The being's attention narrowed like a hand and rested at the hollow of his throat, not touching but aligning. Ray felt a warmth, a focused pressure that was not pain so much as the sensation of a thought pointing at his pineal region, the mythic seat of dream and otherness. Images condensed, sound dissolved. For a time, Ray's reading life, every year of marginalia and missed recognition, fell away, replaced by the pure reception of pattern. He was not transported in a cinematic flourish. There was no sudden motion that ripped him from his chair. Instead, the room thinly peeled away, like a print being lifted from a press, and Ray found himself standing in light that had weight and smell. He tasted dust and an herb he could not name. The air was cool and resonant, as if shaped by the hollow of a long instrument. He was in Uruk, or something that stood in for it in the being's translation. The city did not arrive with a labeled plaque. It arrived as a texture: mud bricks baked in sun, the shadow of a ziggurat throwing bars across a courtyard, and people moving with a purposeful choreography. Priests, tall, wrapped in robes that smelled of cedar and incense, moved in patterns that Ray recognized instinctively as procedural, each step a part of a system. There were objects that glinted like low stones embedded on necklaces, and small, polished orbs placed on pedestals that made the air seem to fold. Ray felt the authority of a place whose vocabulary was function. In the vision, the tablet's phrase resounded differently. "Northern breeze 3 times, door opens" was no mere incantation, but a shorthand line that referenced a complex choreography. Directional attention, threefold repetition, an orienting device that read as process. The alien's transmission layered an interpretive gloss over each syllable. Northern did not refer to a compass point alone. It indicated an orientation relative to a star, a place where light entered the ziggurat. Breeze implied a modulation of breath, not as therapy, but as actuator, an input that caused a small object to respond. 3 times was a recurrence that triggered a shift in perception.
Door opened described not a wood portal, but the opening of an internal channel. All of this arrived in Ray as a visceral understanding, not an abstract explanation. He felt the air move through him as if guided by a choreographer's hand. The priests in the vision did not shout at the stone. They engaged with the world in a way that made attention into an instrument. A priest brought something to his forehead, small, dark, like a seed stone, and Ray felt, through a conduit he did not own, the stone's cold kiss against scalp and the immediate unhooking of a muscle he had not known he had. In the office, his breathing changed in reflexive sympathy. There is a moment when a person experiences an otherwise indescribable physical insight. Muscles loosen because a neural pathway loosens. Blood runs differently because of a recalibration inside the brain. Ray, who had known the medical vocabulary of his condition and who could recite scholarly caution like a litany, recognized the sensation without being able to attribute it. It was a felt opening, a sensation of a barrier lifting at the center of his head. A low hum spread like a distant argument in a room, not audible but felt behind the teeth. Within Ray's experience, the being supplied fragments of its own translation in crisp, declarative bursts. We did not divine, we engineered. Attention is a tool. Memory is stored in living code. He received these not as instruction, but as telepathic commentary, a frame for what he perceived in the vision. The being's odd mix of clinical statement and almost sentimental urgency unsettled Ray. It was as if a teacher had pressed a map into his hands and said, "Look for the seams."
He watched a priest take 3 steps, each step an exact measured movement, and with each step the small stone on his brow emitted a faint, visible shimmer, like dust rising off a drum. After the 3rd step, the priest's eyes widened as if a blindfold had been removed, and he tapped the edge of the stone. That tap was less like a percussion and more like a key turning in a lock. Something inside the priest's posture changed. Attention sharpened, pain seemed to recede, and for a moment the man's expression was uncontainably young. Ray felt the moment twice, first in vision, then as a ripple returning to his body. It was the sort of thing that could be interpreted as healing, but Ray was careful in his internal narration not to let that word settle as a fact. Once he was back in Cambridge, he would find ways to measure nothing and everything. His sleep was deeper for 3 nights, his appetite steadier, his habitual back tension eased slightly. Those were anecdotal shifts he noted in his notebook with a scholar's caveat. Within the vision, however, the consequence was evident. The priest's practice altered the way their attention operated, and something in them shifted. There was also a darker shape to what Ray witnessed. The same tool that made the priest's focus available could be used otherwise. Ray craned forward in the vision and saw a man who had been given command suddenly misread the stone's shimmer as a license, an arrogance that flickered across his face like a bad coin. He ordered a ritual that was too long, too insistent. The stone pulsed in a way that left residue, fatigue in the body, a dulling in the eyes. The people left that day moved slow, like animals walking out of a dream with a fraction of their senses permanently attenuated. The vision did not tell a moral in tidy terms. It offered a simple demonstration of causality. Technique led to outcome, and outcomes had moral weight depending on who wielded them. In Ray's chest, the word terrifying pressed itself into meaning for the first time, not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a real ethical observation. If these practices could sharpen attention, they could also blunt it, open doors, and leave them ajar to intrusion. He then understood why the language had been ritualized. Stories, rites, myths, these carried the shape of the technique, but shrouded the exact mechanism. A myth could travel intact across generations because it disguised the utility behind metaphor. If knowledge could be both a tool and a weapon, it was vulnerable in ways simple facts are not.
The being's telepathic voice, clinical, almost resigned, translated that silence into intent. We hid it. We encoded it where children would sing it. When the vision receded and Ray's office returned around him, the blue light had settled to a soft haze. His recorder sat untouched by the lamp, blinking as if embarrassed at having missed the event.
He was breathing with a new awareness, his chest moving with a measured consideration he did not recognize as his own. The clay tablet on the desk looked suddenly small and enormous at once. Small in its size, enormous in the claim it made about human design and origin. He touched the cold edge of ME37 as if it might be a relic, only to find his fingertip registered the grooves like living text. A dread mingled with awe unfurled in him. It was not the starstruck terror of someone imagining themselves in a movie. It had teeth, an ethical bite. If his inked notes were correct, if, within Ray's experience, the tablet contained codified methods for altering human cognition, then the history he had studied of kings and priests and empires had a new layer of agency. Someone or something had interfered, encoded, and then retreated, leaving mechanisms disguised as myth. He sat back and felt very small and, paradoxically, very responsible. His first thought, the reflex of a scholar, was to document. His second thought, the reflex of a human who had been living with uncertainty, was to wake Margaret and tell her that the world had shifted. He did neither immediately. There was a thrumming sensation in his jaw that made speech feel heavy. The images had braided into his mind with a permanence that felt like a second handwriting. Outside the window, Cambridge went on breathing in normal rhythms. Cars, a distant argument, the soft clatter of a midnight tram. Inside, Ray felt as if a vent had opened in his chest. He paged through his notes with shaking hands. The phrase remained, "Northern breeze 3 times, door opens." But now the words were not a riddle to be solved with patience by committee. They were an instruction wrapped in metaphor, an engineering principle disguised as prayer. He listened for the being again, for some confirmation that the encounter was not only a private seizure of imagery. The blue light wavered by the lamp, then pulled into a thin column and receded, as if someone had shifted attention and left. The room's ordinary noises slipped back into place. The air lost the taste of dust and returned to the bland domestic texture of late night in an old city. Ray made a single, definitive decision. He would not leave ME37 in a drawer. He would not, like the anonymous owners whose names slid through his hands in provenance reports, push it into a quiet archive where its potential would rot. He would test, parse, and interpret. He would keep a record, even if only to remind himself that he had not invented the vision. 100 pragmatic decisions unspooled in his mind. Contacting a friend in Berlin who specialized in archaeoacoustics, a cautious email to a colleague who worked on ritual practice, a discreet note to a private conservator to verify the tablet's age. Ray did what he always did in the face of a claim that could alter narratives. He prepared data. He opened a new file and typed, in clinical capitals, encounter log 0232 AM, blue light, translation claim. He stopped typing when a new detail arrived, softer than the last but no less insistent. It was the feeling of being observed, not in a paranoid sense, but in the sense of being entered into a ledger, his name added to an account. Within Ray's experience, the being had made him a repository. You will be cautious, it said, a telepathic punctuation that felt like an instruction and like a request. We will show you only so much. When dawn came, thin and hesitant as a newly minted coin, Ray found Margaret on the terrace, looking at the city as if she could read its mood. Her voice was steady in the small way that love often is, practical, soft. "You're not at work yet," she said.
I didn't sleep, Ray admitted. He did not tell her everything. He had learned over time that some things need a face to reflect against before they can sustain themselves in speech. Instead, he said, "There's more to that tablet. I think I've been reading it wrong." Margaret studied him, the tilt of her head asking the question he had been avoiding. How much to tell? In the corner of his mouth, ink clung like an old stain. He thought of the blue, and the towering being, and the priests whose faces had taken on new solemnity. He thought of the man in the vision who had misused the stone, of the dullness that had followed the misuse. He thought of secrecy, deliberate and heavy. "You'll go slow," she said. "You always do." Her voice was, for a moment, the steadier thing in the room. She had read history, too, lived with it as the ballast against his flights. "If you're sure." "I am," he said, and the absolute was not theatrical. It was the voice of someone who had been given a map and did not yet know whether to cross the threshold. That morning, he made the calls a scholar makes, a conservator to confirm patina and shortwave radiation levels, a contact at the British Museum who owed him a favor, a former student who now worked with digital imaging. Each call was a small act of fidelity to the idea that evidence mattered. But beneath the work, like an undertow, the residue of the vision remained. He could not shake the image of the being saying, "We will show you only so much." It was as if he had been admitted to a reading room and told the table would be taken away in an hour. At lunch, he walked the old streets, feeling as if every brick might be a field of data, every inscription a folded mechanism. The world had acquired edges it had not had the night before. He passed a group of school children on a field trip, and their laughter hit him with a strange poignance. Children he had seen inventing games out of the smallness of things were, in the vision, the carriers of oral rights. The thought of knowledge that shaped attention being passed through children's play made him uneasy.
If something that sharpened cognition could be taught casually, what did that mean for the distribution of power? He found himself cataloging risks like a man listing expenses. The knowledge could be used for healing, for sharpening the mind of someone wounded or old. It could also be deployed by rulers who wish to emphasize certain stories and erase others. It could make people able to read each other without language and weaponize privacy. Ray's mind moved from the intimate and empirical to the systemic. He had always believed the past was a dialogue. The vision had turned that dialogue into a blueprint with consequences. That evening, back in his office, he drove his pen through the folds of his notes. The more he wrote, the more the phrase "northern breeze" 3 times refused to settle as quaint ritual. It demanded a careful taxonomy. He created a column in his notebook titled Possible Functions and listed, with the qualifier of scholarly caution, items like orientation, breath modulation, repetition as attractor sequences, then crossed them with real-world risk, an empty column that he felt an almost religious compulsion to fill. He did not come to his conclusions easily. Every inference had to be bracketed, every claim couched as provisional. He was mindful of the rules of his craft. Do not conflate mythic language with literal mechanism. Treat visionary experiences as data of consciousness, not of physical proof. Invite skepticism, not derision. Yet even his habit of cautious phrasing felt like inadequate armor against the magnitude of the idea. If the origin story of humanity included an external influence that had encoded capacities into its creatures, then the word terrifies because it touches responsibility. Who gets access? For what ends? Under what ethical guardrails? Late that week, sitting at his kitchen table with Margaret, Ray spoke in the sober little code they used for serious matters. "If I'm right," he said, "this changes a lot. Not only what we call myth, it changes responsibilities." Margaret, who had the plain wisdom of someone used to sorting shoes at the door, nodded slowly.
"And who else knows?" she asked. "Not many," Ray said. "Not yet." He left the sentence open. It was a sentence he had been waiting to say out loud for days, and also the one he feared hearing back. The idea of forbidden knowledge always conjures conspiracies in popular imagination. But Ray's fear was more pragmatic. He imagined institutions who would fetishize control. He imagined private collectors who would hoard practice like relics. He imagined governments deciding that attention modulation was a tool for social engineering. That night he sent encrypted emails, careful and flinty, to people who might understand the technical language and withstand the extraordinary claim. He did not attach the vision as evidence because he knew the bar for credibility.
He attached photographs, high-resolution images of ME37, and a short clinical note that suggested there might be procedural meaning behind certain recurrent phrases. He wrote as any good scholar writes, with restraint and an invitation to verify. He could feel, even then, the thin line between curiosity and hubris. He knew the intoxicating quality of knowing something that others did not. He had felt the taste of that wine in other rooms. The being had told him, within his experience, that attention was a tool, that memory was stored as living code. The claims in the vision were enormous, but they were not invitations to mania. If anything, the visitation's tone had been inflected with caution. "We will show you only so much," it had said, as if afraid to overwhelm a mind that could break the shape of a community. And so Ray worked methodically, like a man translating a treaty. He cataloged, cross-referenced, tested hypotheses against texts he had memorized for years. There were small confirmations, the kind that bent probability but did not overturn it. A phrase in ME114 that echoed the structural wordplay of ME37. A notation in ME203 that hinted at directional orientation. Each echo did not establish truth, but suggested architecture. Those echoes were enough. They were the grain of a larger pattern. On an ordinary Thursday, in the quiet middle of a seminar, Ray received a brief message from the anonymous address where he had shared images. "Thank you. We will come to you." No signature, no flourish. A thin line that could be either supportive or ominous. Ray stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a pulse. There is a peculiar terror in being sought after, in moving from the passive category of lonely scholar to node in a network. He had asked for input, and input had arrived. He thought about the being in his office and wondered if this was how attention propagated. A small spark sparking another spark. Networks were not only technical phenomena, they were ethical ones too. Every person added to the chain multiplied both benefit and risk. He could already imagine debates, academics insisting on repeatability, spiritual seekers insisting on sensation, governments insisting on regulation. The terrifying truth about origin was not simply that it involved external influence. It was that the possession of that influence reshaped power. The next night, after Margaret had fallen asleep and the kitchen hummed with the soft noise of the city, Ray returned to ME37. He placed it under the lamp with reverence, like a man placing an old friend on a pillow. He did not know whether the being would return. He did not know whether his colleagues would find his conclusions plausible. He only knew that the blue light had given him an experience he could not reduce to sleep or hallucination. He felt the echo of the vision as a new permanent register in his body, the memory of a pressure at the brow, the sense of a small stone warming to the touch. Those were experiences that, in their phenomenology, could be described and compared, but not proven. He kept them in his notebook as phenomenological notes, bracketed by asterisks and the phrase, "within Ray's experience." And then, as he turned out the lamp and prepared for a shallow, labored sleep, the blue returned, not as a flood this time, but as a distant echo, a distant presence that made the teeth at the back of his jaw ache. It felt like an invitation or a warning. A thought, precise as a thumbprint, arrived unbidden. We do not reveal only to instruct. We reveal to test stewardship. The words were not accusatory. They were, in their own cold register, a judgment that acknowledged a scale of responsibility bigger than Ray and Margaret, bigger than a scholar in Cambridge. Ray's imagination supplied all the ways that responsibility could be abused. He imagined workshops strewn with people perfecting attention as a commodity. He imagined the man in the vision who had overused the stone, now with access to power. He imagined entire populations subject to refined manipulations. He also imagined the positive possibilities blazoned with restraint. Elders reconnecting to memory, trauma processed by new attention, communities cultivating compassion with renewed capacity. The dual edge of knowledge had never been more clear. The being had offered an unadorned glimpse of both blade and balm. Sleep found him later, shallow and vivid. He dreamt of rows of clay tablets. For every visible tablet, there seemed to be 1,000 more, stacked in subterranean vaults like sleeping animals. In the dream, a child hummed an old rhythm, and a stone warmed against their brow. The child smiled, and the world, for one bright moment, seemed less fractured. He woke to sunlight and the thin mundanity of email signatures. Life demanded signatures and meetings and the payment of small bills. But under those small concerns lay a tectonic possibility. Ray put on his jacket and walked toward the department, feeling the weight of a story whose edges had not yet been revealed. When the blue visited again, it did not arrive as frequently as his heart wished. It came with the same reserve. The being did not offer to be a teacher in the way a human might teach. It offered translation and demonstration within the limits it chose. Ray would learn in fragments, in images that could be cross-checked against the tablets, but never fully reduced to them. The being's refusal to hand over everything felt at once maddeningly protective and terrifying. He began to see the contours of the next step of his work, to find others who had glimpsed similar patterns, to assemble evidence without creating a panic, to create a network small enough to remain ethical and large enough to withstand malicious acquisition. It felt like building a boat to carry a cargo that might drown or save. He called Margaret and sat with the decision like a man weighing valuables on scales. "If you go," she said finally, "be careful. If there are others, be sure they're not looking to use what they know." "I will," he promised. The promise felt like a small bootstrap salvation against the minds he imagined that might weaponize attention. Ray went to the meeting with the careful apparatus of a lone academic: a notebook, a pen with a losing cap, a phone turned off. The spot was an unremarkable cafe near a square where pigeons argued for scraps. He arrived early and sat with the cup cooling between his palms. People moved through the room in ordinary ways. Lovers arguing, students grading papers with the brutality of youth, while in Ray's chest, the sense of an approaching threshold hummed. A woman approached his table, not with the theatricality of a spy, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had made similar choices. She carried no badge, no eccentric signifier. Her hair was cut short. She wore a scarf that smelled of lemon oil. Her eyes were tired in a way Ray found familiar. She sat without invitation. "You sent images," she said without preface. Her voice held a science's and an artist's cadence. M37. "You can't," Ray started, and then realized how foolish that sounded. The idea that anyone could have read his encrypted note was naive. "How did you get access to the images?" "We are networks." "We are networks," the woman said, and her calm carried no flourish. "Not a cult, not a corporation. People who have seen echoes of what you described and want to compare notes." Ray felt both relief and the chill of exposure. He closed his notebook a fraction too forcefully. Across from him, the lemon oil scarf twitched with a small smile that had none of the theatricality of someone testing him. "Names?" he asked, the scholar's reflex to catalog not entirely suppressed. "Alia," she answered, "archivist,
for 3 systems of collectors. I handle provenance anomalies. We split time between libraries and fieldwork. I don't wear a badge because the point is not to advertise. There's a physicist in Lisbon who's been recording anomalous EEG correlates during dream states. There's an ex-military linguist in Toronto who... She stopped, as if the list itself had weight. We're small. We meet in places like this. Ray let the word network settle in the air between them. It implied nodes, redundancies, committees, and possibly the very regulatory structures he feared. He had imagined talking in private rooms and back channels, the way secrets often moved, through envelopes and vaults. Alia's plainness suggested a different shape, decentralized, cautious, human. "Why you?" Ray asked. He wanted to know why she had reached him instead of other obvious scholars. Why reply to my note? Alia's expression softened. Because your framing did not read like a hoax.
You bracketed visionary experience as data. You preserved sources, and you included the tabs of ME114 and ME203 in a way that suggested pattern seeking, not prophecy. That matters. We needed someone who would be as careful in speculation as they were in method. Her candor threaded through him like light. In the months since the blue, Ray had oscillated between the need to believe and the need to prove. He had wanted partners who could withstand both. He nodded. "What do you want from me?" "To see, to compare, to decide." Her fingers tapped the rim of the cooling cup. "If these patterns are real, we need epistemic hygiene. Some people think ritual equals placebo. Others insist there's an anthropological continuity that explains phenomena. We suspect there's a structural technology encoded in ritual language, but suspicion isn't evidence. We're trying to build a responsible apparatus, modest field verification, peer-reviewed methods, and ethical commitments that are enforceable by network participants." There was a sentence in her answer that smelled of bureaucracy, and Ray felt a curious relief. The world would insist on procedure even for the most extraordinary claims. He pictured meetings with checklists and a small committee with sticky notes. There was a courage in that tedium. They met again the following week in a rented room of a lecture theater that smelled of old chalk and coffee. Alia arrived with 2 others. A compact woman with a neurologist's hands named Dr. Sato, who carried the kind of skepticism born of years in imaging labs, and a man, Jonah, who had the precise, weary face of a former intelligence officer turned archivist. His hair was prematurely gray, and he kept glancing at the door as if doors themselves were untrustworthy. They began by laying evidence on the table like artifacts: photographs, high-resolution images, spectral scans, anonymized accounts. Ray presented his notes, the boxed section he always labeled with inexperience, and then, with the same cautious language he had used in emails, he described the vision. He did not dramatize the blue. He said, calmly, "Within my experience, a being translated a tablet in an embodied way and allowed me to witness a practice." He spoke of the sensory impressions, the stone against a priest's brow, the threefold repetition, and the risk of misuse. Each time he used an evocative phrase, he added the bracket, "within experience." Sato listened with the sort of attention that resembled a machine learning process. She asked targeted questions that probed for variables, for confounds, sleep patterns, medications, prior neurological conditions, and emotional state. She did not dismiss his claims. She was, bluntly, the kind of skeptic Ray wanted, methodical rather than dogmatic. "We can't assume the phenomenology is veridical," she said, "but experiences produce measurable correlates. If this pattern repeats across independent witnesses, we can begin to argue for an underlying structure, psychological, cultural, or neurophysiological. We need samples." Jonah, who had spent years cataloging illicit caches of looted artifacts, produced a list of private collectors and sale records that looked like a genealogical chart of secrecy.
Objects move into private hands for many reasons, he said: security, profit, prestige. But sometimes it's deliberate containment. Someone decides a thing is dangerous or destabilizing and buries it where authorities won't trample it, often for reasons as mundane as taxes and as grand as ideology. Alea's eyes were steady. We need both documentary and phenomenological evidence. The tablets are pieces of the argument, so are the accounts. We triangulate. Over the following months, the network unfolded incrementally like a careful excavation. They did not recruit, they received. People wrote from odd corners. A teacher in Ohio who had used a phrase from a poem and noticed students' attention widen. A retired curator in Rome who had cataloged an item with a marginal notation that matched the phrasing of ME37. A Palestinian archivist who had seen community healers use chants bearing structural echoes of the tablets. Each account was annotated and, where possible, cross-referenced to a tablet, a notation, a provenance. Patterns accumulated the way sediment does, small echoes that suggested continuity. ME114 contained a notation with a directional marker that, in Ray's reading, echoed the northern orientation of ME37. ME203's palette of verbs suggested repetition as a functional operator. None of this was proof. In the language Ray and his colleagues used, it was architecture, suggestive, parsimonious patterns that begged explanatory work. As they gathered, ethical questions proliferated like mold in a damp library. If attention was a tool, who authorized its training? How did one prevent dilution into ideology and weaponization? Who watched the watchers? The network instituted a modest charter: voluntary anonymity, ethical review for any public demonstration, and a strict rule against monetizing practice as a commodity. The charter read like a prayer to caution: teach only with consent, never in coercive settings, document harms as well as benefits. It was a delicate scaffolding, an effort to bind what could not yet be proven into responsibility. The network's first public act was small and carefully staged. They convened a closed conference with a handful of invited peers: archaeologists with reputations to lose, linguists with a taste for patterns, and clinicians curious about phenomenology. They presented photographs, not witnesses. They refused to include visionary claims in the formal program except as notes identified as personal reports. The invitation list itself was an ethical statement. Many politely declined. The field, for all its hunger for novelty, bargains in reputation. Those who attended returned to their institutions with sober reservations and a single, unnerving curiosity. One young archaeologist, a quiet man named Tomas, sent Ray a private message weeks later. There is a funeral song in a rural archive that uses this pattern. It is pre-imperial, by the way. I can't publish yet, but there's commonality. Another, a senior epigrapher, wrote a line that would become a small lodestone. If ritual is code, then the code is social. The effect depends on interpreter and context. Interpreters multiplied. Some practiced in small, consensual groups, testing responses in ways that were ethically reviewed within the network. They did not seek miracles, they sought reproducibility of phenomenology, consistent descriptions of attention, bodily feeling, and after effects. Some people reported shifts similar to Ray's: a quieting in the chest, a sensation of a hinge opening behind the eyes. Others reported nothing. A few reported discomfort, transient headaches, nausea, dizziness, phenomena the network documented diligently and reported to Dr. Sato, who tracked physiological correlates. It was during one of these monitored gatherings that the terrifying dimension of their work became unavoidably visible. The session was small: 4 people, 2 researchers, and an archived clay impression pressed into wax as a visual aid. They intended to document responses to ritual phrasing and spatial orientation. They were not trying an activation. The room was under clinical observation, and Sato's instruments hummed in silence. A man named Alonzo, new to the network and notably charismatic, insisted on demonstrating a phrase he'd learned from an elderly woman in a remote village. He delivered the phrase with enthusiasm and then, against protocol, repeated it louder and with increased insistence. The room's air seemed to thicken. 2 participants reported a sudden drop in vision clarity. One later described a heaviness in the limbs. Alonso himself appeared flushed, exhilarated, then quickly alarmed. For all their planning, the room had not anticipated the variable of zealotry. Within 20 minutes, one participant left the session with a lingering fog in the head. She would later describe days of dulled affect, a listless, flattened mood that she, with shame, called a dulling. Sato's scans showed a transient change in alpha rhythms, and her clinical note used conservative language, perturbation, washout effect, nonspecific. The network convened emergency meetings. They reasserted the charter, tightened consent procedures, and instituted a moratorium on unsupervised demonstrations. Ray sat in a small office after the episode and felt the old, precise fear return. The one he had felt the night he saw the priest misuse the stone in vision. The pattern was painfully simple. A tool that sharpened could, in the wrong hands, blunt. Repetition could be a key or a blade.
The terrifying truth about origin was not merely that something had interfered with our beginnings. It was that whoever shaped that interference understood the moral hazard. The Anunnaki, or whatever one chose to call the visitors in the vision, had hidden techniques because they could be misused. Now, centuries later, a handful of earnest people could rediscover a practice and weaponize attention unintentionally. In the months that followed, the network's public profile remained minimal. But information, leaky as any human enterprise, began to seep outward. One of the collectors Jonah named in his list sold a lot quietly at auction. Some buyer's catalog noted odd marginalia. An image of ME37, low resolution and lovingly photographed, appeared on a forum for antiquities connoisseurs. Within 48 hours, a thin, dissonant chorus arose. Sensationalists who wanted spectacle, researchers curious for collaboration, and those with darker appetites who spoke in euphemisms about applied focus for strategy. The leak was not catastrophic, but it generated a new variable, a tension in the modern landscape. Information amplified quickly. People who wanted to commercialize practice began to call. Those who had power and means began to ask not about ethics but about application. Governments, rumor claimed, sent formal inquiries. Ray received one terse, polite email from an official channel he had not expected to reach him. "Your collaboration is of interest. Can we discuss this?" He forwarded the message to the network and waited. If the being had hidden knowledge to prevent misuse, the story suggested a reason. Power accumulates when attention is engineered. In the vision Ray had watched, councils at Uruk debate not the existence of the techniques, but their distribution. There had been a conversation about stewardship that had turned on the edges of fear. Ray had seen, in that received image, a set of wizened faces. There was a palpable sense of doing harm by doing too much and causing collapse by doing too little. The network staged a modest, public document, an ethical statement deliberately simple and written in language accessible beyond academia. It read, in essence, "We will not train without consent. We will not accept funding that compels secrecy. We will prioritize harm reporting." The statement did not stop curiosity or profiteering, but it signaled an attempt to bind knowledge with responsibility. Ray's own stewardship choices hardened into a pattern. He agreed to speak to a handful of carefully vetted colleagues, he archived his encounter logs in multiple encrypted locations, and he accepted a modest advisory role in an online forum the network moderated. He refused offers of funding that smelled of secrecy. He turned down invitations to speak at venues that promised spectacle. Margaret noticed the recoil. "You made this a thing," she said one night. "You made it manageable." "I tried to," he answered. His voice had a tiredness he shared with old books. The blue was no longer his alone. It had emerged into a community that required constant tending. The Anunnaki deliberation Ray had glimpsed in vision returned in fragments across the months. The being in Cambridge did not show him complete counsels. Instead, it allowed him glimpses. A chamber where tall figures argued in measured tones, where the vocabulary belonged partially to deliberation and partially to regret. Within Ray's experience, the visitors had considered dissemination as a kind of contagion. They had asked, can a species shoulder enhanced attention without fracturing? In one image, a figure traced a diagram that suggested an ecological model: population, resource, attention, and then drew a line that separated nodes deemed stable from those unstable. They spoke of thresholds and tipping points, terms that reframed ancient deliberation in ecological language. One particular scene cut to Ray with brutal clarity. In a courtyard beneath the ziggurat, a council had observed a city's transformation after an extended period of unfettered practice. For a time, productivity had soared. Artisans were precise, medical knowledge improved, and long memories allowed teachers to transmit complex skills. Yet, imbalance seeped through social fabric. Certain families accrued influence through disciplined attention. Others were marginalized. The society's narrative coherence began to fray as attention concentrated in ways that privileged specific taxonomies of knowledge. The Anunnaki, if Ray's received judgment was to be trusted, had seen the emergence of stratified cognition and chose withdrawal as a corrective. That judgment had not been moral in a simple sense. It was pragmatic and terrifying. To withdraw knowledge was to allow a species to evolve without a particular set of capacities that might make them ungovernable, unpredictable, or dangerously efficient in ways that threatened ecological or social stability. The image lodged in Ray's chest, not a heroic reticence, but a cold calculation about risk. That calculus, ancient and modern, was central to the title that haunted him. The terrifying truth about our origin was not merely a revelation about external influence. It was a revelation about intentional omission. When Ray told the network about the deliberations he had witnessed, they treated the report as data, narrative evidence, comparable to archaeological inferences. Some found the idea consoling, arguing that restraint had allowed for resilience. Others found it chilling, believing it to be a paternalistic interdiction that robbed humanity of its potential. The debates were sharp and humane. The network's charter insisted on pluralism. They would not decree future policy. They would attempt to hold the knowledge with humility. Within the network, small practices proliferated, but always with guardrails. They described phenomenology, not manuals. Volunteers participated in monitored sessions under medical supervision. Sato published a cautious paper on the neurophysiological correlates of the reported experiences, an article deliberately thin on causal claims but rich in method. The academic community's reaction was mixed. Some praised the rigor, others criticized the lack of replicability. The mainstream press picked up faint threads, then let them fray as public attention turned to other news. In the quieter margins, communities continued their work. Not all communities were benign. Ray learned of a small private clinic in Eastern Europe where a charismatic leader offered an accelerated program. Testimonials circulated, both glowing and cautionary. An investigatory journalist connected to the network visited undercover and found coercive dynamics, hours of repetition and isolated participants. The clinic's founder vanished from public view before legal action could be taken. Ray felt a cold vindication. His worst fears, stewardship turned spectacle, had been realized in miniature. That episode hardened the network's policies. They began to lobby discreetly for regulatory frameworks that would make it difficult for unaccountable actors to set up exploitative programs. They advocated for patient protections, informed consent, and public registries of practices. They did not seek prohibition. Prohibition would only produce black markets, but they pushed for transparency and oversight. Through it all, Ray changed.
The obsessive lamp that had once defined him softened into an instrument of stewardship. He continued to translate, to argue philological nuance, and to press for method. Margaret's garden continued to be a sanctuary. She sometimes sat with him in the evenings and asked gentle, practical questions he had not expected to have to answer. Who trains the trainers? How do you stop people who sell what you won't? She had seen the network fuss like a careful counsel, and she had also seen its limits. Ray had no full answers. He had only commitments. In the quieter hours, he still experienced fragments of the blue. The being appeared to him in reticent bursts, as if granting a reading room by appointment. More scenes unfurled. Priests recording marginalia into clay. An apprentice copying a pattern and misplacing a sign. A council member altering a phrase to obfuscate functionality. Each vignette reinforced the central worry: knowledge is political. The alien narrator, telepathic and concise, offered occasional commentary, an odd hybrid of clinical diagnosis and moral counsel. "We encoded privacy," the being transmitted once, a line that felt like a legal clause and a lament. "We encoded ritual, so children could carry it, and so that it would not be weaponized. You have found a seam. Handle it." The admonition felt less like accusation and more like a covenant. Ray took it to heart. He felt the responsibility of an archivist entrusted with explosive material.
He thought of the man in the vision, once arrogant, who had left people dulled and changed. He thought of the clinic, the private auction, the list of names Jonah had compiled. He thought of the possibility that knowledge, once unbound, could change the distribution of attention in ways both subtle and systemic. At one point, an internal fracture threatened the network's cohesion. A subgroup, frustrated by the slow pace of institutional acceptance, argued for making a public demonstration, an event that would show experiences to a broader audience and force academic institutions to take notice. The proposal read like impatience flavored with good intentions. Ray objected. He made the argument in the network forum with the careful rhetoric of his trade. Evidence first, replication second, public demonstration only with full ethical safeguards. The debate was rancorous. Some accused the cautious core of cowardice. Others accused the impatient faction of potential harm. The fractiousness crystallized the network's identity. They were not seeking spectacle. They were not trying to create a new orthodoxy. They were a patchwork of people who had touched a seam and decided, differently at times, to hold it with deliberation. Ray's posture hardening into stewardship felt less like ownership and more like guardianship, a complex, imperfect responsibility. Years blurred into a sequence of small accomplishments. Sato's longitudinal study that documented transient neurophysiological changes without grand claims. A curated exhibition of ritual artifacts that reframed certain phrases as functional rather than merely liturgical. A cautiously cited paper about directional markers in Sumerian tablets that used Ray's translations as a case study of method rather than conclusion. The network maintained its modest charter and expanded slowly, like moss. Ray's name circulated only quietly in relevant circles. He retained his freelance work, linguistic consulting for museums, small translations for journals, the gentle life of a man who still loved the angle of a wedge. He returned to Margaret's small garden and learned, as he had promised, to be present. Yet the blue never left him entirely. Its memory was a seam within his perception, a luminous scar that sometimes hummed when he read a particular cuneiform sign. The most piercing moment came not from triumph, but from a moral test, a government request with an ambiguous tone. It did not promise glory. It offered resources and the aura of legitimacy. It also carried undertones of strategic interest. Ray consulted the network. They performed their ritual methods of governance, careful review, votes, and ethical checks. The votes split. Some argued that collaboration with an institution could bring oversight. Others argued that the history of state secrecy made any such partnership fraught. Ray cast his vote with trembling care. He rejected the offer. He feared the compromise would be slow poison. Access for the network traded for control by others. The network respected his position, and the decision stood. The rejection stained him in some eyes as obstructionist. In others, it painted him as a principled steward. The judgment would hang in archives and correspondence like a small footnote about character. Through all of this, the original question posed by the title, what if our origin included an external influence encoded in ritual, remained unresolved in the strict epistemic sense. The evidence accumulated, but never became incontrovertible. None of the network's work, nor Ray's visions, forced a unanimous conclusion. The story remained a tapestry of data, speculation, ethics, and human fallibility. That ambiguity was not a weakness, it was integral. The terrifying truth was, in part, precisely that. Origin stories that could grant power also demanded an ethic of custodianship whose forms were not trivial to invent. The narrative's final brushstrokes were modest rather than apocalyptic. Ray, in a step that felt both inevitable and humane, helped found a small institute, a deliberately modest structure with rotating readership and a publicly accessible registry of practices and harms. It was not an empire. It was a communal endeavor to translate curiosity into responsibility. They offered a resource, an annotated index of tablets, contextual notes, and a companion ebook that framed the phenomena as speculative, interdisciplinary, and ethically complex. The Institute refused to teach activations as protocols. It documented phenomenology, recommended medical supervision for anyone exploring conscious practice, and directed skeptical readers to independent peer review. On a late autumn evening, years after the Blue first entered his office, Ray stood on the terrace with Margaret. The city below shimmered in the kind of honest way only an old town can. Lights, small arguments, the unremarkable machinery of human life. She had become an active presence in the Institute's governance, rubbing the edges of his obsession with the practicality of a gardener pruning a rosebush. They had built a life in which restraint had become an ethic. "You did what you could," Margaret said softly, leaning into the warmth of the scarf he'd chosen for the night. "I did what I thought I should," Ray replied. He thought of the Anunnaki deliberation he'd witnessed, their decision to withdraw to protect a species from itself. And he felt both sympathy and a residue of indignation. The long view had chosen restraint. The short view had shown temptation at every turn. "Do you still wonder?" she asked. "All the time," he said, and meant it. Wonder had become a companion. He had traded the solitary lamp for a ledger of responsibility. The terrifying truth about origin, he had learned, was not a single revelation, but an ongoing ethical project. That night, in the quiet of his study, Ray opened the Institute's public repository and placed ME37's images with an annotated note. He wrote, carefully, "The following materials are presented as part of a speculative corpus. They are intended for interdisciplinary study. They are not a manual." He added an appendix detailing harms and a clear admonition. Avoid unsupervised practice. Consult clinicians where appropriate. When he finished, he felt an odd, tentative peace. He had refused grand pronouncements and chosen instead to build small institutions of accountability. He had not solved the question of origin. He had, instead, chosen to steward uncertainty. Before he went to bed, he felt, as he sometimes did, a familiar pressure at the hollow of his throat, the residue that had once aligned him with the being's attention. It was not a summons now, but a reminder. You were shown only so much. Stewardship is not completion. It is the practice of tending. The alien's telepathic cadence returned, soft and precise, as if paging through a ledger. Within Ray's experience, the being offered no counsel for modern governance. It offered only an observation. Knowledge travels. Human hands carry it in varying proportions. "Why show me?" Ray asked aloud, a rhetorical question to which he had no naive expectation of reply. There was an image,
A child in a courtyard stringing clay tablets like beads. A laugh that made the air look fragile and human. The being's transmission, concise as ever, arrived as a line of meaning more than a sentence. We test stewardship, it said, not to punish, but to learn how a species uses the gift. Your species is in progress. Ray understood. He had not been chosen because of purity or wisdom. He had been chosen because, in a small way, he was willing to shoulder uncertainty and to build slow institutions. That was not a heroic destiny. It was a mundane form of courage. In the Institute's modest atrium, a plaque held the title of their first public brief: Custodianship and Curiosity. Notes on Ritual, Memory, and the Ethics of Attention. It did not shout. It invited. People came in ones and twos, bringing marginalia and cautious curiosity. Some left unimpressed. Others joined the small mailing list. None became a movement overnight. The terrifying truth about our origin, Ray thought as he closed his eyes, was twofold. First, that humans might contain traces of external intervention encoded into ritual forms. Second, that discovering those traces opens a moral horizon that is difficult to navigate. The first is speculative and requires humility. The second is urgent and requires structures. He fell asleep to the city's modest chorus. When he dreamed, he saw clay tablets stacked like a small city beneath the ground, and children running in the streets above. Each child hummed a fragment of an old phrase, not as technique, but as music.
The dream held no simple answer, only practice, a rhythm of care and caution that might, in some futures, make modest difference. When dawn arrived, gray and precise, Ray made a small entry in his notebook: stewardship as practice, not as ownership. He added a line, gentler than the rest: curiosity without humility risks harm. He wrote it in the margin as a reminder to himself and to anyone who might later read his notes, that the terrifying truth of origin is not merely revelation, but the ethical labor it demands. At the Institute's website, a careful, sober hub, they framed their offerings the way the network had always tried to, with transparency, with disclaimers, and with a stern insistence on safety. An appendix listed sources, references to ME 37, ME 114, ME 203, and a modest bibliography of relevant epigraphic and neurophysiological literature. It invited readers to learn more responsibly. It offered a link to the companion ebook and a moderated forum designed for interdisciplinary dialogue, clearly moderated and with strict rules against solicitation and commercialization. If you were to ask Ray whether the blue had given him hope or terror, he would have had to answer both. The origin story it suggested carried wonder and responsibility in equal measure. It demanded neither blind acceptance nor reflexive rejection. It required stewardship. The knowledge was not an absolute gift nor a curse. It was a threshold, one that human beings, with all their contradictions, might cross with care or misuse with haste. He spent the rest of his days in the modest work of tending that threshold, translating, teaching the ethics of restraint, and watching for leaks. Sometimes, in the hush between tasks, he would feel the faint echo of that first blue wash and remember the towering thing that had shaped his life. "We are networks," Alia had said in that cafe. And networks, Ray had learned, are the social form of stewardship. Messy, human, faltering, but capable of holding complexity when governed well. The final thought that sometimes visited him in the small hours was not a revelation of simple origin, but a question that echoed with moral gravity. If our beginnings are stitched with hands that sought to protect, what are we now to do with the knowledge we retrieve? The terrifying truth about our origin was not solely the presence of an outside influence.
It was the realization that any disclosure of that influence instigates a set of decisions about power, care, and restraint. He kept working. If this story stirs a question in you, if curiosity wakes in a similar way to the way it did in Ray, consider one small ethic. Seek evidence, respect limits, and assemble accountability. For those who want to study further, there is a companion brief available with careful references, ethical notes, and resources for responsible inquiry.
Explore it with skepticism and care. Join communities that prioritize consent and safety. Insist on peer review and transparency. The origin, as this account presents it, is complicated, terrifying at times, hopeful at others. It asks less for belief than for careful, ethical attention. And that, perhaps, is the most human response one can offer to a truth that refuses finality.